Welcome, and we're so delighted to see so many people here to help us celebrate the Marin Civic Center's 50th anniversary and Frank Loyd Wright's role in that, and its past, its future, and what's happening today at the Civic Center. So welcome and thank you for coming. And then secondly, we wanted to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the American Institute of Architects, many of which it brought you here, that organization. The Marin County Frank Loyd Wright Civic Center Conservancy, a commission to ensure the preservation and of this building. They've done such a great job over the years, something the community should be very proud of. And lastly, the Marin County Free Library, library room, and I need to particularly say that one of our fellow commissioners and board members on the Conservancy really did a wonderful job of ensuring that we're accurate in what we do and to make this event happen. So thank you. And with that, I'd like to introduce John King, our moderator for tonight. John is the architectural critic for the Chronicle and makes sure that we're all well informed about good architecture in the area and bad, and author. So thank you, John.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you for being here. Anyone who cares about architecture in the Bay Area, it's no surprise you're here. As someone who is not a trained architect or anyone with a degree like that, but is kind of a regular journalist, it's interesting kind of just to know how few buildings in the Bay Area really resonate beyond the Bay Area. You know, so much of this place is the light, and it's the water, and it's the topography, and it's the thread of neighborhoods and things like that. But there are a few buildings that people from outside who care about design, who care about architecture, kind of feel it is essential for them to see when they are here, and certainly the Marin Civic Center really stands out with that. It's one of the press release said the last commission. I'll leave it to Wright experts to say if that's correct or not, but it's certainly the last significant building of his that was commissioned or completed. And it's a remarkable building to me in that it's also perhaps Wright's most accessible building. I mean, obviously the Guggenheim Museum is in Manhattan on Central Park. Lots more people go by it, so on and so forth, but you have to pay a ticket to get a certain distance in. This is a building that anyone can experience. You can eat in the cafeteria, you can wander the aisle, wander through the atrium, so on and so forth, go out on the patio, chase down bureaucrats, whatever you want to do. There are a few large Wright buildings, and there are certainly few large Wright buildings that are this public. And so that's why it's such an exciting building and also such a remarkable trust for the county of Marin to have it. Paul Turner, I'll introduce the panel in a second, but you're going to be hearing the history. I'm curious, how many of you went on the tour earlier? Okay, then I'm sure you picked up. It's actually speaking to Felix Warburg, who was on the Planning Commission, I think, back at the time. And anyone who knows anything about the building knows that just like buildings today, when a big shot architect comes and proposes a big dramatic building, a lot of people think it's the worst idea ever, and they resolve to stop it any way they can. And if the client is a big, free-spending government body, that makes it all the more the kind of the red meat waved in the face of critics. So, the building had lots of drama, and it stopped construction, so on and so forth. But the fact is, it's a remarkable thing that to exist at all and to continue to be public and to have, and this might be controversial, to have held up as well as it has held up. Before I introduce the panel and move on, I want to just read two quotes. One is from Wright. He made a visit to Marin, kind of checked out the site, spoke to people, made all sorts of Frank Loyd Wright dramatic statements, insulted this and dismissed that. But I did a piece on the building a year or so ago, and he talked about his excitement at the idea of doing a public building of this sort, at a scale of this sort. And he talked about architecture is the blind spot of our nation. Here comes a crucial, critical opportunity to open the eyes, not of Marin County alone, but of the whole country, to what people gathering together might do for themselves to broaden and beautify their lives. And I like that quote because it shows the potential of buildings on the landscape. You know, you can aspire to do something lasting, not just beautiful or whatever, but something that genuinely resonates. The other thing I want to read is from Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the first architecture critic at the New York Times. She died last year. She was at the Times from the early 60s into like 1980 or so, and then wrote for various places, the Wall Street Journal, the last 10 years or so of her life. And she did a biography of Wright in 2004 and concluded, not the end of the book, but she talked about this building as Wright's last great project, just saying that the building shatters convention for a solution of remarkable environmental amenity, which, to get high praise from Ada Louise Huxtable, is an impressive thing. So the way that tonight will work, the panel goes until 8 o'clock. I think I'm supposed to tell you it's being taped. It's on TV. It will go on YouTube if the questions are dramatic enough. And what we will do is the panel will make, there will be 3 presentations, and then from there we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then I'll come back to the podium and, with the time we have left, take questions. So I want to introduce the panel. First person speaking will be Professor Paul Turner. He was trained as both an architect and historian and taught the history of architecture at Stanford for many years. He's now a professor emeritus. His publications have focused on French and American architecture, including works on Corbusier, Frank Loyd Wright, and the history of the American campus. He wrote the introduction to the very good Princeton Guide to Stanford University's architecture. If you're spending a lot of time on the campus, I recommend it. At Stanford, he has had a special interest in the Hanna House, designed by Wright in the 30s using an innovative hexagonal system of geometry. Following the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989, which seriously damaged the house, Turner chaired the university committee overseeing the restoration of the building. And Paul will be speaking about the building, kind of what was going on in American architecture at the time and the building within that. The second presentation will be by someone who needs no introduction in Marin. Supervisor Steve Kinsey, who has been on the Board of Supervisors since 1996 and has lived in West Marin since 1978. In office, he is focused on watershed and fishery restoration, sustainable architecture, and the integration of transportation and land use planning. Steve serves on the boards of organizations including the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, the child advocacy group First 5 Marin, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and now the California Coastal Commission.
Correct. Yep.
Which is a big deal appointment. He has a degree in architecture. He rushed to tell me he's not an architect at this moment. And he received his degree at Arizona State University, which is a long way from his current home in Forest Knolls. The last presentation, which will be on kind of the future of Marin Civic Center and just kind of how you plan for something of this stature. This will be a doubled presentation by Mark Cavaniero and Manuela King. Mark began his career in the New York office of Edward Larrabee Barnes Associates. In 1989, he co-founded Barnes and Cavaniero in San Francisco, which a few years later became Mark Cavaniero Associates. The firm was recognized with the AIA California Council's 2012 Firm Award. Among his projects, many of which have been civic and often involve tweaking and things to architects like Frank Loyd Wright, include the Oakland Museum of California expansion, the Community Foundation in Santa Cruz County, Savapool in San Francisco, the Palace of the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, and the recent SF Jazz Center. One of his very small projects right now is a 1,000 square, I believe it's 1,000 square foot cafe pavilion, but it happens to be at the cafe, at the California Academy of Sciences right next to Renzo Piano's building. And Renzo actually came and took a look at the plans on site, which is kind of like Frank Loyd Wright coming back from the dead. And presenting with Mark is Manuela King. She is a principal at Royston, Hanamoto, Alley, and Abbey, RHAA, Marin-based, I believe. During her 28 years at RHAA, Manuela's portfolio of more than 100 completed projects has continued to evolve. Her early projects focused on the Northern California region. Since becoming a principal of the firm in 1997, she has expanded the firm's portfolio into a full range of project types, extending its international influence while balancing high design with sustainability strategies more and more, pursuing work that captures landscape architecture's potential for artistic expression and having fun, and the ability to bring humans into a more balanced living relationship with natural systems. So I first will introduce Professor Turner. Thank you all.
Thank you. Well, with the first slide here, as you can see, this photo shows the Marin Civic Center after the first section. The administration building was completed in 1963, what we're celebrating here tonight, the 50th anniversary. But before, construction began on the second section. And here we see the interior, also a photograph of 1963. And here, the whole structure after the completion of the Hall of Justice in 1969. I was asked to talk this evening not about the Civic Center itself, but about what else was happening in American architecture during that period when this complex was being planned, to get a sense of how Frank Loyd Wright's design fit into its architectural context or was different from it. So we're talking about the 1950s and early 60s, essentially the post-World War II period, a time of increasing prosperity in the United States and therefore of growth and lots of construction and generally a spirit of optimism. All of this was recognized at the time by architects and historians and critics, and a lot was written about what soon came to be called mid-century modernism in architecture. In preparing my remarks, I looked again at several of the books on this subject that came out at that time, and I'll make some observations about the architecture of this period, especially some of the buildings that received the most attention. Now, it's often assumed that Frank Loyd Wright's work throughout his career was so unprecedented or ahead of its time that it stood alone and had no parallels. We also tend to think of the mid-century period as being almost completely dominated by the international style, which we know that Wright disliked, to put it mildly. But I'm going to try to suggest that the story is a bit more complicated than this. Now, it is true that a large number of the buildings of this mid-century period did fit clearly into the international style framework, and let's see some examples. Here we see the Seagram Building in New York, built in 1958 by Mies van der Rohe, who had come to the U.S. just before the Second World War and built a number of prominent buildings. Two more examples. His Farnsworth House in Illinois of about 1950, and Crown Hall at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Mies's version of the international style was adopted by many American architects and firms, such as SOM, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. Here's their Lever Building in New York of 1952. And I should also mention Richard Neutra, another European architect who had come to the U.S. earlier than Mies, and developed his own version of the international style. Here we see his Kaufman House in Palm Springs of 1946. The same Kaufman family, by the way, that had earlier built Frank Loyd Wright's Falling Water in Pennsylvania. The international style tended to be favored especially by large firms and the leaders of the architectural profession. And this can be seen in a publication produced in 1961 by the American Institute of Architects, the AIA, devoted to the buildings that had received its honor awards over the last 12 years. More than 200 buildings of all types, commercial, residential, government buildings, and so forth, and the great majority of them could be called international style in one way or another. Here we see a typical sample of the commercial buildings in the book, which happens to include the Crown Zellerbach building in San Francisco, 1959, up in the upper right there. And here, a group of hospital buildings from this book. By the way, not one of Frank Loyd Wright's buildings had received an AIA award during this period. They had given him a gold medal in 1949 for his lifetime achievements. They apparently realized that they had to do something to recognize the most famous American architect. But the AIA tended to think of Wright as too individualistic or eccentric or unprofessional in certain ways. And Wright made no secret of his contempt for the AIA. He never joined the organization, and in one interview he called it, quote, a harbor of refuge for the incompetent. Now, actually, this was not quite correct. The typical AIA members were largely competent. It was more imaginative qualities that they probably tended to lack. But it was a typical remark, of course, of Frank Loyd Wright. In any case, these AIA awards didn't give the full picture of what was happening in American architecture at this time. Another overview had been given several years earlier in an exhibition and book produced by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1952, built in USA post-war architecture. And here, Wright was not only included, but one of his recent buildings was featured as the book's frontispiece, as you can see here, the Laboratory Tower addition of 1949 to his Johnson Wax Company buildings in Racine, Wisconsin. This attention to Wright by the MoMA was a bit surprising because the Museum of Modern Art was strongly associated with the international style. And Philip Johnson, the curator of its architecture and design department, was one of the most vocal proponents of the international style. Johnson wrote the preface to this book, and in it he spoke about the crucial importance of the international style to modern architecture. And he said, quote, every building in this book would look different if it had not been for the international style. So, Johnson was implying that even Wright had been influenced by the international style. Wright, of course, would have disagreed vehemently. According to him, if there was any influence, it was all the other way around. Personally, I think that some of Wright's later works do reveal some influence from the international style. And the Johnson Tower is an example of this. But that's really another topic that I can't really get into here. Well, several other recent buildings by Wright were also featured in this MoMA exhibition and book, such as his second Jacobs House in Wisconsin and the V.C. Morris store here in San Francisco. Wright's little masterpiece just off of Union Square, whose interior can be seen as a kind of tryout for the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which Wright had been working on but whose execution kept getting put off until the late 1950s. So he was really playing around with this idea in his creation of the V.C. Morris store. Still, many of the buildings in this MoMA exhibition were the familiar international style works. The buildings of Mies and SOM and Neutra and Walter Gropius, here his Harvard Graduate Center of about 1950, and the United Nations buildings in New York of the same time, mainly the work of Harrison and Abramovitz. And one of the best-known contemporary houses in America was included. Philip Johnson's own glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut, also of about 1950. This was perhaps the purest distillation of Mies van der Rohe's ideal of minimalism, less is more. And needless to say, Wright was not impressed by it. The story is that when the house was completed, Johnson invited Wright to visit. And when they got there and went in, Wright said, "Well, Philip, do I take my hat off or leave it on?" To Wright, this hardly even qualified as architecture or enclosure. He might as well have been outdoors. Well, the MoMA exhibition also included buildings that represented variations on the international style, such as the Maimonides Health Center here in San Francisco by Erich Mendelsohn of 1952, which actually harked back to designs made by Mendelssohn many years earlier in Germany. And there were even a few buildings that were very different in character, such as a house in Arizona by Schweiker and Elting, apparently inspired by Wright's Taliesin West. And another house in Arizona by Paolo Soleri and Mark Mills, both of whom had been apprentices of Wright and had picked up his fascination with unconventional geometric forms. Well, the dome here may suggest the geodesic structures of Buckminster Fuller, even though it's not strictly speaking a geodesic dome. And in fact, there began to be a renewal of interest at this time in Fuller's structural innovations, as some of his concepts began to be executed following the Second World War. Here, one of his geodesic domes under construction in Louisiana at that time. And there were other similarly unconventional designers who were receiving some attention at this time, such as Bruce Goff, another former Wright apprentice. Here's his Bavinger house in Oklahoma, built in 1955. Or John Johansson, here a design and a model, never constructed, for what he called the Airform house, to be made by spraying concrete over an armature of steel tubes and wire mesh. This design and a couple of the works of Fuller and Goff were illustrated in a book that came out in 1959, Architecture USA by Ian McCollum. And the Airform house was even shown on the book's cover, as you can see. But these sorts of designs were considered really fringe and generally weren't taken very seriously. And nearly everything in McCollum's book was much more conventional and mainstream. But still, there were some important departures by this time, even in the work of successful mainstream architects. And one example is Edward Durrell Stone. Stone's early work had been fully international style in nature, but by now he was exploring something rather different, often covering his buildings with pierced screens of one sort or another, as we see here in the Stanford Medical School buildings of the mid-1950s, or the U.S. Embassy building in New Delhi, India. This is a model of the building. It was built. Well, traditional modernists tended to criticize Stone's buildings as merely decorative or superficial. And Frank Loyd Wright didn't like them much either. He called this Indian embassy building the Taj Maria. Maria was Edward Stone's wife's name. Wright, as we know, could be a little nasty when he wanted to be. But there was some irony here, because one of the sources of Stone's pierced screens probably came from Wright's own work, his textile block designs, as he called them, which he'd been experimenting with since the 1920s. Here we see one example of this, is Anna's house in Los Angeles of that time. Also, many modernist architects criticized some of Wright's work as being merely decorative. In any case, more significant in the long run than Edward Durrell Stone was another architect who became prominent during this period, Louis Kahn, who developed a distinctive system of design which first appeared fully in the late 1950s in the Richards Medical Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Kahn analyzed each architectural program into its functional parts and let this shape the design. And in this way, his approach was somewhat similar to Wright's, in contrast, say, to the international style, which tended to favor one system for all building types. For this medical research building, Kahn structured the design around what he called served and servant spaces, the servant spaces being for things like circulation and the extensive mechanical equipment needed for a building like this. Kahn followed this up with another research building, the Salk Center in La Jolla, of about 1960, where the design not only followed this rational analysis of the program, but also was strikingly beautiful. Most people agreed in its organization of forms and their relationship to the site, a high bluff overlooking the Pacific. Here we see another view of this Salk Center. But the architect who probably attracted the most attention in the late 50s was Eero Saarinen. He, too, had begun as a faithful modernist, but then, over a tragically brief career, he died young in 1961, he produced an amazing body of works, which often resulted from innovative structural forms. Here we see his Kresge Auditorium at MIT, utilizing a thin shell concrete dome supported on only 3 small points. But just as interesting, Saarinen used a completely different type of form for the other part of his MIT commission, a small chapel, which he enclosed in a cylindrical brick structure, producing a striking contrast with the auditorium. They're on the same field at MIT, so you see them together. Then, in quick succession, Saarinen produced more explorations of unusual structural forms. A hockey rink at Yale University, the TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport in New York. And here we see another view of it. And the interior. The Gateway Arch in St. Louis. And then the Dulles Airport terminal in Washington. A word that was sometimes used to describe Saarinen's designs and those of some other architects of the period was formalist, that is, suggesting a fascination with differing and unusual forms. And in this way, I think Saarinen's work is similar, actually, to Frank Loyd Wright's, especially Wright's later designs, where there's also a fascination with unusual and striking forms. For example, in the Guggenheim Museum in New York, was finally built in the late 1950s. Or Temple Beth Shalom in a suburb of Philadelphia, also of the late 50s. And here we see the interior of this synagogue. Or the Unitarian Church in Madison, Wisconsin, of a little earlier, Not to mention, of course, the Marin Civic Center itself, where this emphasis on dramatic form is so strong. Here we see another photograph taken in 1963, just at the completion of the administration building. This, by the way, is one of a series of fine views of the Civic Center taken by the architectural photographer Ezra Stoller, who was Wright's favorite photographer for his buildings. Another innovative young architect of this period whose work began attracting attention was Paul Rudolph, especially in his art and architecture building at Yale, designed and constructed at the same time as the Marin Civic Center. This building shocked many architects and critics by its violation of a number of modernist principles. For example, it seemed unnecessarily complex, even perversely complex, both in its exterior form and its interior spaces. And in fact, Rudolph was probably inspired in part by Frank Loyd Wright's love of spatial complexity. But there was something else that was considered odd in this building, a kind of humor or game playing, seen, for example, in Rudolph's incorporation of classical sculpture and other historical forms and details that had been banished by the modernists. And peculiar architectural jokes, like having classical columns framing a small auditorium, except that only the capitals of the columns are actually here, floating at the top of steel rods, a kind of foretaste of postmodernist humor. Also during this period, more attention began being given to regional styles of architecture, such as the Bay Area regionalism of Northern California, with architects whose work, while certainly not all the same, did tend to share some traits, such as informality and the use of natural materials. Here we see Foothill College in Los Altos Hills by Ernest Kump, built at just the same time as the Marin Civic Center, like so many of the buildings that we've seen. And a house in Berkeley by Warren Callister of about the same time, and part of a complex of buildings by William Worcester at Stanford, the Center for Advanced Study, and buildings at Sea Ranch, north of here, by Charles Moore and his firm, Moreland and Whitaker and Turnbull, of the early 1960s. Well, in this review of what was happening in American architecture during this period, I've tried to suggest that there was a great deal of variety, some of it very different from Wright's work, but some of it similar in one way or another, and that there was lots of innovation. Wright was not the only innovator. Yet, in the final analysis, Wright still stands out, in my opinion, for the imaginative power of his work, even at the very end of his amazingly long career. Indeed, what was probably most remarkable about the Marin Civic Center was that here, in his last major work, when he was over 90 years old, a design that had to be finished and then executed after his death by others, notably Aaron Green, that here, Wright still was able to come up with a powerful basic concept, a series of arches bridging the hills of this beautiful site, a concept which could hold its own with any of the other works of American architecture of this period. Thank you.
Be a short exam at the end. Thank you, Doctor. What a privilege for me to be here this evening, to not necessarily get into the deeper details of architecture and its critiques, but to just express in my own personal way what a privilege it is and how exceptionally proud and thankful I am to be able to be working in Mr. Wright's building and having been able to do so for 16 years at this point in my life. Every day, every week, I take a moment and reflect on some element of what I experience here and express gratitude within, and often when I run into others, I get to share it with them. I'm especially delighted in the early morning when these piercing angles of the sun come penetrating down several levels in the light wells, and the calmness before the crowds is stellar. Steve Kinsey, I've been a county supervisor. I live in West Marin, but I had a history that associated me with Mr. Wright from a very early age. I was going to school in Wilmington, Delaware as a sixth grader, and my friend David McTighe brought out a book at the bus stop, and he showed me a picture of Frank Loyd Wright's Falling Water. And from that moment on, I knew there was something about building design that was going to stir me. And I actually, as a paper boy, imagined every morning as I would go out some piece of my life that led along to a place in the Southwest where I would get my degree in architecture and I would get the opportunity to practice. And for 20 years, I had my own design build business before becoming a supervisor. And I was able to fulfill that really tremendous opportunity. And in addition to that, I have some other associations with Mr. Wright that set me up and set the stage for this exciting opportunity to be in his building. As I said, I got my degree in architecture at Arizona State in Tempe, Arizona, not far from the desert location of Taliesin West. And in my second year as a young architecture student, one of my projects was to develop a modular design, and I had the opportunity to work at Taliesin with Vernon Schwabeck, one of the associates there in that particular class project of mine. So I began to see and feel what the Taliesin world was like. Today, and for the last 25 years, my parents live just over the ridge from the McDowell Mountains where Taliesin West is tucked into, in a planned community that would certainly have benefited from Mr. Wright's help. And even Taliesin West today is a bit of a sad experience because encroaching suburban development has virtually wiped out the desert feel until you get onto the campus. And so certainly take the time if you get down there to enjoy a tour. I also had a privilege as a young supervisor here, just having arrived, to meet and talk to Aaron Green on a couple occasions in a fairly animated and engaging way. It was really a privilege. And the lasting memory I have is even at that point in time, he was complaining about the way the cornice of the jail was dealt with, and he was hating the paint. And but at the same time, he had some ideas of how we could improve the vegetation. And so he was in it for the life, and I think that's true of most people that care about Frank Loyd Wright. We're in it for a lifetime. Some things I mentioned, the light moving through is particularly appealing to me aesthetically. The horizontal infinity of these corridors is just such a dramatic expression of architecture and space, and of course capped by natural light. It really captures Mr. Wright's connection of the natural world to the built world, and it also provides this very dynamic, ever-changing interplay all day long. Just ask the folks on the 4th floor of the Civic Center during the summer. There's quite an interplay with the light well. The other thing that just strikes me, and I encourage you, for those of you who have the opportunity to come back a few times, if most of us walk through the south portal and come in our day-to-day, but some of you have court issues, I'm sure, so you can walk through the court entry, the other portal. Very few of you go through the Sally Port, which was the old jail, but some have. And of course, now we have the new jail and its own entry. And I find the entrance experience is just exceptional. If you think about it, it's really a bold idea to just span these hills with this building, then create these gaping awning arched openings that you can watch cars and people moving into, and then they disappear into the building. All of the offices whether they're used or even sort of encouraged, have these decks or walkways off of the building on the east and west sides. And then, of course, we as supervisors, and I want to recognize Supervisor Sears, who's here with me this evening, and she serves on our conservancy, we have a little slip up in his concept of democracy for all, because he gave every supervisor our own access onto a luscious plaza that sits behind us and overlooks the cafeteria patio. And, you know, I can see that he still had a little bit of King Faisal in him when he was doing this, because he certainly gave us a royal opportunity as supervisors to enjoy that indoor-outdoor experience. The other thing that I think, you know, at some point I'll share just a few of my favorite details, but one that I can't miss talking about when we're thinking about entries is the Wizard of Oz gates at the front of that building. They are just absolutely delightful, and to think that we've been able to keep them moving for 50 years is a testament to the care and consideration that our public works staff, the people who take care of this piece of art, have given to the building overall. And the other one that I particularly enjoy, or have, at least historically, is the exit on the 4th floor out onto the hill and the landscape garden there. To think of this building that from the freeway and from many points approaching it is the largest structure I think we could imagine in Marin County, and yet when you walk out that 4th floor, you stand taller than the roof. And it hovers just above the ground there. And it's such a way of touching the earth at the end of this exceptionally long structure that I thought was such a creative and intimate solution. I would just say that one of the things that I am dealing with, and I should be moving on to those things, is what we've been doing with the building since we've had control of it over the last 20 years, or actually I should say stewardship responsibilities, really. And that is the world of ADA, and it has not particularly been kind to Mr. Wright's work. And I think the 4th floor is one of the disappointments I feel, not because of anyone's design work, but just because it simply couldn't be handled in a way that kept the exquisite design sensitivities and simplicity of what Mr. Wright gave us. And when I say Mr. Wright, of course I acknowledge his associates, who really carried the vision for him. But they certainly were, you know, I don't know if they were in the seances, but they certainly were in the spirit of what Mr. Wright had in mind. There's one other little office that I want to mention to you in that indoor-outdoor arrival or not. This one is one that there's very few of us that get to arrive at, but in the years of walking around this building, all the different floors, I've come to believe that the very sweetest space in this fine edifice to do work in is the finance director's office. So it's a little tip to you. Go look for the finance director's office. He's got taller ceilings than any of us do. He's got an absolutely beautiful garden that sits right outside of his door, and he's on the cool side of the building. So I don't know what the county administrator wants to do with that, but I want to acknowledge that Matthew Heimel is here contemplating how to get it back. The improvements during my time here, let's talk a little bit about that. The first one is a great example of what happens when you let someone who has no political experience get into political office. I was elected to the Board of Supervisors in 1996, and of course, before that time, I had a ponytail so that people wouldn't even ask me to run for office. Unfortunately, when the idea came up and I bit, I earnestly went out and tried to gain the support of folks, and I met this council member in Corte Madera by the name of Phil Joya, and Phil said to me, I'll support you, but when you go down to the Civic Center, if you're successful, I want you to clean up that spire. And so, of course, I got elected. I came in. I thought, you know, every politician makes promises they got to keep. I took advantage of what we call the sort of honeymoon goodwill that DPW offers supervisors, one opportunity, and said, hey, Mehdi Sajjadi was the public works director. Couldn't we clean this spire up? And it had a lot of soot on it. It was years and years of being used. And this was Mr. Wright's form and function. Form doesn't follow function. Form is function. Well, this was the function of a chimney for a very sooty incinerator, and so it was quite dirty. So they said yes, and they penciled out the $80,000 project that about 5 years later, at 10 times that cost, after we had waited 8 months for the barn owl to finish their mating, we were able to complete the jigsaw puzzle that actually required us to take everything out from the top down to get to the place we wanted to be. That was a good lesson for me about capital projects in the public world. In addition to that, of course, one of the most challenging things, and I think one that could concern us all, is the seismic upgrading of this building. As you know, throughout Mr. Wright's career, he gloated over his hotel in Tokyo that survived, while almost any other credible engineer was willing to criticize his thinking as not structurally sound. Here, after major earthquakes that happened in the 1980s, Loma Prieta in particular, but also Northridge down in Southern California, we were faced with a $25 million seismic upgrade to bring this building up to standards, not that would keep us going after a big one, but get people out without losing significant lives. And that was very challenging. I give tremendous credit to the engineers, architects, and the contractors who pulled it off. But if you go to the cafeteria today, you'll see some very angular bracing that's boxy. You'll see some pipe columns across the light wells. And for all of the pieces of it that are visible, there's a tremendous amount that isn't, that we really were successfully able to conceal within portions of the building. And for the ones that are there, I would say that I give some credit to my former colleague, Supervisor Annette Rose, who still serves on our Cultural Commission, for having an eagle eye and a passionate concern for keeping Mr. Wright's vision intact and forcing engineers to think like architects. It was good. It was really good. What else did we done? In addition to that, of course, one of the things that I used to say about it when we would, kind of casually walk down those beautiful hallways, I was telling you that artificial infinite of the horizontal hallway. Well, it was usually in the wintertime, the artificial infinite of Rubbermaid buckets that just stretched to the far horizon. So, of course, somebody told me once that we should call it Falling Water West. That was pretty good. But we were determined to kind of take this indoor-outdoor thing and control it a little bit. So I just want to say, for anyone who ever wants to be critical of earmarks, think again, because it was the earmark that Senator John Burton pulled off when he was the president pro tem that provided us with the funds to substantially, if not completely, take care of the waterproofing and the leaking of our roof. And so thank you, John Burton, for all the things you've done that I don't thank you for. This is one I really do thank you for. And it made a huge difference. So, what else? The other thing that I just quickly will touch on, and I want to leave Manuela to speak about landscaping on this campus, but when I came here, we were coming out of a very difficult period in the early 1990s when there had been a really penetrating recession, when Proposition 13 was taking its full effect and impact on the community. And one of the things that had been let go of by the Board of Supervisors was the landscaping. They pretty much had abandoned it. And the islands, the medians, the grassy areas, the trees were really in a terrible state. And I will give personal credit to Steve Petterly, our own Marin County Parks landscape architect, who spent a couple years thoughtfully coming together with a plan that was responsible in terms of its irrigation requirements, its consistency with the vision that Mr. Wright and Mr. Green in particular, actually, along with William Wesley Peters, had put together, and took out some of the trees that were actually blocking the building and the enjoyment of the building. So we've thinned out some of the taller trees over the years. But most importantly, if you come here in March or April and see the opening of the red bud season on our medians, you'll be more comfortable paying your taxes. It's really good. The old jail. We had the jail. We certainly, I'll leave someone else to tell the story about how we had the new jail. But once we had a new jail, we didn't need the old jail. And so what to do? How do you remodel a jail? Well, I can tell you we got around to it after letting it sit around for quite a while. And it now is our county council's offices. I don't know if there's any deeper meaning there, but that's who's there. And at some point, it would be fun for any of you to see what they have done with the exercise yard. I'll leave that as another surprise for you to seek out, because it is a really uptown, urbanized sense of the indoor-outdoor experience that Mr. Wright had in mind when he planned this building. So check out the old jail. The only other thing, I think, there's two other real quick things that have been on my watch. One is... and this one I'll just mention that, we talk about this building because this is the Civic Center, but we're on a campus, and I think that our board realized, and you're going to hear from Mark Cavagnero and Manuela about the master plan ideas that we put together in the early 2000s for the campus as a whole. And so I'm just going to mention this is a project that actually took place and completed last year at the Marin Center. But for those of you who haven't seen the revised plaza and entry into the Marin Center, I really want to encourage you to do so, because of all the things that I think we have had to swallow related to ADA, the American Disability Act, the actual plaza, which is a tilted plane that eliminated all of the broad, shallow steps that Mr. Wright so favored, with a tilted plane that is completely accessible to all without any ramping or any segregation of disabled from the general public, is a beautiful expression of, one, a successful ADA project, but two, what I believe to be the next generation of respect for Mr. Wright. And I did see that Fanny Hansen, the architect, is with us this evening, and I do want to acknowledge Fanny for bringing into that design a sense of ceremony, a sense of artistry, an absolute playfulness, and an understanding of what organic architecture looks like in the 21st century. So thank you very much. I'd give her, yeah. The last project I've been involved with, I'll talk about very quickly, which is when I came here, I heard about the rug room, and we still talk about meetings in the rug room, even though the rug room doesn't have a rug anymore. But when I came here, the rug room had a rug, even though Mr. Wright didn't want to see any coverings on the floors. And so we have a little kind of thing goes on around here about the true right-of-files will never allow a rug on our floor of our office, whereas there's this kind of creeping willingness to put down carpets in some locations. That's just an inside understanding of why the rug isn't in the rug room, but was at one point when there was a board that really didn't value Mr. Wright's big vision. So coming soon, quickly, Northern Gateway, we're going to be doing some really powerful entry opportunities for biking, walking, bus opportunities for increased accessibility, a way to get from the new SMART station, which will be coming fairly soon. It also sets the stage for what we would like to see as a renaissance for our cultural center over there on the other side of the street. And it will improve accessibility all the way up to our buildings here. Also, we're going to be starting later this fall with our south portal, doing the changes in the main entry to this building. And again, I feel like Supervisor Sears and I have hawkishly worked with our team to try to hold on to the fact that Mr. Wright understood simplicity and limited amounts of embellishment, except on his cornices here. Again, King Faisal. But that will be going on, and it will include some other signage opportunities And then, of course, we're about to complete next year, and our entire sheriff's division, including the patrol division and the administration, will be moving to the Ross Commons down on Lucas Valley Road. And although that's not the Civic Center, it will mean that there will be a significant piece of the original design that will then be space for us to reallocate amongst a growing and changing set of needs in our county. I'm going to just jump quickly to a couple things that I can be critical of. When I was in architecture school, Mark might relate to this. We'd go to look at these outstanding pieces of architecture, and we would struggle to ignore everything that we so admired and just look for the things we could give a hard time to. And so I've spent a few years here trying to go, well, what's wrong with this building too? And of course, if I worked on the fourth floor all summer long, I'd know what's wrong. There's a tremendous overheating problem in the Civic Center, and although we've spent years and millions changing the mechanical systems and have a significantly more energy efficient building, that's still a problem. And then, of course, there's this thing that I love, which is our signage capability. One of the things about this exciting building is that every once in a while I read the missing persons reports, and I see families of people who have been lost looking for the court floor for weeks at a time. So we have work to do there. The other thing is, and just as a very sobering thing, really, in some respects, in a week where we just honored those who suffered under 9/11, but I was here for 9/11, and what I can say as post 9/11 is that Mr. Wright's vision for democracy doesn't lend itself to response to terrorism. I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of openings in this building. We have the ability to drive your vehicle right into it. And as a result, while we had to deal with a wide-ranging set of anxieties with our own staff, our sheriff, I think, was able to convince the Board of Supervisors pretty quickly that we just have to have faith in our community. So that's a piece of this that carries on. The one last thing I will say is that as a supervisor, just today I came off of, along with my colleagues, a 3-hour hearing on our housing element. And as you know, as passionate as we can be about Mr. Wright's building, our community is about protecting the beautiful natural landscapes that we have. And so I think that while most of us deeply appreciate how much we as a community have worked to protect our environment, I just want you to think with me for a moment about Mr. Wright. Imagine him, that long mane, coming through the windy south portal. In that regard, I think he either liked to see his hair move or he wanted to see the women's skirts become a challenge, because that south portal is a wind tunnel. But assume that we saw him coming in here, but even more importantly, imagine him trying to convince a 21st Century Design Review Committee or the Planning Commission to let him put his building between the ridges, to let him have a 7-story elevation that stretches 3 football fields long on Civic Center Drive. And then when he brought out his color board and showed him the gold roof, do you think they would have said, no, it needs to be blue? No, the point I want to make is that we have protected Marin, but we've reached a point where we're so concerned about not doing the wrong thing that we've made it incredibly challenging, if not impossible, for remarkable, audacious, exceptionally great architecture to happen here. And it is a price that we've paid for protecting our county. So I appreciate the chance to reflect. I'm tickled by the opportunity. I'm thankful that we have 50 years. Just like all the rest of us, it gets more expensive to take care of ourselves as we age. The challenge that we face is we put our artwork outside. We're going to have to pay for it as we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is Manuela King, landscape architect. I'm Mark Cavaniero, an architect. We were hired about 8 or 9 years ago to work on the Marin Center project, which is really a long-term vision and a master plan for how the rest of the campus would be used. we really did not focus on this building other than how it set the tone in the original vision that Frank Loyd Wright had for this larger campus. And the idea was to look ahead the next 40 or 50 years and see what might the county do to get more utilization out of the site. Terrific. This is a nice segue, I think, from Professor Turner's presentation, which is on the left, the image from 1954, and on the right, 2004, when we began this process. And what's interesting on the left is this site, which is sort of in the center, lower center of this image. There was the water and the lagoon and the marsh. There was nothing to the west. There was no Santa Venetia really left. There wasn't a Terra Linda, and there was just the hills. And when Wright came out here to see the site, it was very much north of the development of Marin County. What you see on the right is what it is today. It's been developed on all sides of it, and the Civic Center has become a much different place. It's even a neighborhood park as well as a county center, the county seat, and a civic center for all these activities. But Wright was really looking at virtually a virgin piece of land and trying to decide how in his world you would create something out of that. We spent a great deal of time going through all the various places in the county where the original drawings were kept. It was quite difficult to sort out what was done by whom and when. But I think it was interesting. This was probably the last drawing that I think Frank Loyd Wright himself was involved in the generation of it. And in it you could see the Hall of Justice and the administrative building on the lower left. Then there was the vision for the auditorium here. That circle is still in the parking lot. This long axis through the island, that would be for children activities. A wonderful idea for an open fair structure. And then another circular element here, which was an auditorium with a pool. Lots of different uses, restoring and creating the lagoon and the marsh. But Wright really had a vision for how all this would come together to be a place for government, for justice, for people, for activities. And then we looked at how we might have organized this. What was the logic he was using? It was really overwhelming for me to try and understand the logistics. And the premise I came to is this spire, which is a beautiful element right here, which is at the height of this middle hill, was really Wright's organizing element. That to the left, the building that was never built, I believe it was Health, Education, and Welfare, was simply that Hall of Justice transferred over. That axis takes you down to where he did build the post office. This axis takes you out towards where the lagoon, the water, and the auditorium were, etc. And it seemed like, in Frank Loyd Wright's view, everything was looking back towards the spire, the top of the hill, and of course Mount Tam beyond. And what was wonderful about that is it organized the site, and it brought into play the idea of these three hills, just as Supervisor Kinsey talked about, that these buildings rush out and actually combine these hills. And then there was a model we found that was pretty similar to that in spirit. The auditorium, Highway 101, the Health, Education, and Welfare building unbuilt, Hall of Justice, Administrative, Post Office, these elements, the island, the auditorium, this wonderful fair structure on axis, organizing the space, and the spire. If you look at it today, or close to today, what we see that was developed was the auditorium is not here, but located at the end of that axis. The lagoon, of course, is in existence. There was an exhibit hall built years later in the late 70s. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And this large paved area, which has really become the primary use for the fair. Here you see the wonderful, very successful Marin County Fair when it's in use for 5 or 6 days every July. And this whole area is a vast network of tents and activities and spaces and rides and entertainment. And here you see, of course, the exhibit hall, the auditorium, and the very end of the Hall of Justice. And so the concern we had in a master plan point of view, if this was in fact the organizing element, the spire on top of the hill, the middle hill, and these axes come out from the administrative building and the post office, and the relocated auditorium is here, what we felt early on was that unfortunate was the exhibit hall was turned with its back towards Mount Tam, the spire, and the rest of this wonderful space. It was really organized on the parking lot and the arrival here into the building. And we felt like from that point of view it wasn't working well. So here you see it now in an architect's drawing, the exhibit hall with really its back, the convex side of the building, focused really on the parking field, the auditorium with its entry here towards the island and the lagoon, the parking field, and the subsequent jail that's been talked about. Manuela?
So, as everyone has said, it's been an honor to work with the county on this amazing project. And just so everyone knows, the campus is 160 acres. 80 acres of it is landmarked as a National Historic Monument, and 80 acres is not landmarked. And those other 80 acres are the Marin Center. The Marin Center boundary is somewhere near the lagoon and heads north and includes the Christmas tree lot next to Highway 101 and then the back side of the exhibit hall and parking. So we were brought on to look at the Marin Center, which was that 80 acres. However, as a landscape architect, I never can limit myself to a project line. I always look beyond that. And so we really had to consider that the Marin Center was part of this larger campus, and we needed to look at it holistically. We needed to find a way to balance the county and the community needs with the historical vision and preservation. And to do that, we needed to understand the key drivers in the campus core design that Frank Loyd Wright did. Today, I get nervous in public speaking, so I was kind of nervous, and I decided to take a drive. And I drove back to China Camp. I don't know how many of you know where that is. It's right back San Pedro Road, and it's absolutely beautiful. And it's one of the few places where the bay, the natural bay and the wetlands come up to the oak woodland, and it feels very much like it probably was 50 years ago. And so I started to look at that, and I started to think what it was like for Frank Loyd Wright when he came here. You look at the aerial photo, and you see the development that's happened since this project was originally planned. But when you go there and you really picture what it would be like to come to this site with this beautiful oak woodland, the wetland comes up the backside. Some of you may not know, but you can actually kayak to this campus. There are inlets from the bay that come the whole way back to the backside of this property. And so thinking about what that would feel like and how genius it was for Frank Loyd Wright to come in and to set the building as he did, and then to look at it now and to see the development that's encroaching ever more close to this building and really changing in many ways the character of the building. If you think about the building, and in this quote, we know that Frank Loyd Wright focused on the landscape, but here's a quote that I found. "We know that the good building is not the one that hurts the landscape, but is one that makes the landscape more beautiful than it was before that building was built. In Marin County, you have one of the most beautiful landscapes I've seen, and I'm proud to make the buildings of this county characteristic of the beauty of the county." So I think that the original idea of setting this building in these beautiful natural hills is an absolutely profound one. And now when you go out and you see those natural hills, there's only one viewpoint coming down Highway 101 where you really still sense that. And everywhere you go around the building, you see the surrounding development coming closer and closer. So thinking about that and thinking about how to approach the Marin Center master plan, I'm deviating a little bit from Marin Center, but it's all part of the same thing. And then another thing, and Steve mentioned this too, that the process has changed over time. And you know how much we are now a community-based process. We respect very much the opinions and thoughts of the people that use public spaces. And so the process that we went through on Marin Center and that we go through on most of our public projects right now is very strongly community-centric. We have extensive public meetings, we have workshops, we collect ideas and thoughts from the community. And I think that sometimes those thoughts can result in a distilled down idea. So to be a strong designer, you have to grasp that essence and then hold on to it through the community process and try to meet the needs of everyone. It's definitely a challenge and a balancing act. So the beauty of the center as it sits in the view across the lagoon right now is something that we wanted to capture and retain. When we looked at the original plans that Frank Loyd Wright had done that Mark showed, and I believe Paul showed these also, there's not much suggestion of landscape. You can see pretty much, it's hard to even tell what it is. It just is a big brown area up there and over here. So we weren't left with a lot of ideas from the master plan as to what the landscape should be. This is a slightly later one, but again, you can see there's just a lot of undeveloped area around the Marin Center. So there really wasn't a driver that told us this is what the Marin Center master plan should look like. And then we thought about what it is now, and this is what it is. It's an asphalt area in your prime central part of the campus. The reason why it is because it's very flexible and can be used for the fair, but the fair only happens 5 to 6 days out of the year, and the rest of the year it's an undeveloped asphalt area. So that was definitely something that was driving us as we were starting to look at the Marin Center plan. The auditorium at least has some planting around it, but once again, it sits pretty much in isolation behind a parking lot and next to the big asphalt area. So when we think as landscape architects about it, as I said, we have to look holistically. And the Marin Center site is here. Sorry, I'm nervous, my hand's shaking. Here, up there, and back there. So that is the 80 acres of non-landmarked site. What that means, in the landmark site, you have to abide by the Secretary of Interior's guidelines for treating a historic landmark, and you can and should. So everything within those 80 acres that are landmarked has to respect the original character-defining features of the design. Really important. The oak woodland, the hills, the view corridors, all of those things are absolutely critical. Outside that boundary, you also have to think about those things, but you have a lot more flexibility to make decisions based on what the current program and needs are, and that's what we were doing with our plan. So if you think about what Mark was showing and the kind of site organization and the spire, those were all drivers for us as well. In addition, taking that asphalt area, which is right here, and creating a new heart for this campus. One where you could take that and convert it into a real usable year-round flexible space. The other thing that we needed to do was to find a way to complete what we call the green necklace. So there are gaps in circulation. If you're pushing a stroller or strolling around the lagoon, there are places where you can't even find a sidewalk to walk on. You kind of bounce along on some gravel. So we really wanted to find a way to complete the circulation around the entire campus. And there are a series of spaces, each with a different kind of personality in the Marin Center, but we needed to link those together through a series of circulation routes, through a consistent landscape treatment, through architectural treatment. And in addition, to bring in some specialty features that emerged as part of our public meeting. There was a great desire to bring in art, to recognize children, to keep the flexible places for the fair, but include places for daily use. So this is the plan that we came up with. It has some key elements to it. We have a large central plaza adjacent to the new buildings that Mark's going to be describing. We have a great lawn that fronts onto the lagoon with a series of plaza spaces off of it. We have a children's island. We have a designated farmers market area, and for those of you who haven't been to the Marin Farmers Market, you have to come. It's the best one ever. It's so good. We have a sculpture garden back here. We have a nature area in the backside, and this is where I said you can actually kayak up to this point. We put a kayak launch in. And one thing that we've done, Avenue of the Flags, for those of you who don't know where that is, also is kind of the north gateway to the campus. Right now, it looks like a parking lot. It doesn't look like much else. But to get to the exhibit hall or to any of the back buildings, you have to go down the Avenue of the Flags, which feels like, A, you're driving through a parking lot, or B, you're going the wrong way. But you're not. You're going to the right place. It just doesn't feel like it. So our plan looked at taking Avenue of the Flags, acknowledging it with a gateway entrance that allowed a gateway sense to the entire campus on Civic Center Drive, and then created new auto drop-offs for the buildings that Mark will be describing in a few minutes. So in essence, we had a main plaza that is about double the size of Union Square. This is Union Square, so you can see the plaza Plaza and Great Lawn together were double the size of Union Square, and it would be something like this. It would be a flexible space that would still allow the fair to happen, but would allow a wide variety of uses, concerts, and daily use to happen. We have the Great Lawn, which fronts the lagoon and replaces the asphalt. Again, something that would be beautiful and an appropriate setting to be in and look back to the Marin Civic Center. We have these special places, a children's garden, a water feature, the farmer's market, the sculpture garden, an outdoor classroom on the wetland in the back side of the site. And we have a completion of the circulation system for everyone, bicycles, pedestrians, and vehicles. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Mark.
I just wanted to point out in Manuela's drawing here of the circulation, this element is a proposed bridge that would hover just above the water to connect this large parking field across into the open space, and where we're proposing a new lobby and entrance to the auditorium. Right now you enter from the side. It's very small. Those of you who've been there know that the lobby is way too small to serve a 2,000 person audience. So to make this whole space activated and to connect it, this plaza would really serve as a forecourt, the auto court, and the actual entry to the lobby. This would be an elegant way to connect and to get more utility out of these parking lots, so you don't have to build yet another and consume the open space. This drawing, I point that out because this drawing demonstrates the idea of this long, low bridge that would hover right across the lagoon. Just as Manuela had looked at circulation in different zones for activities, we were looking at different zones for the building and how it would work and what were the vital areas that needed to be respected. Again, if we go back to the existing site, the auditorium, the exhibit hall, the lagoon, the island, we started looking at some of these connections. The bridge that would tie into play this assembly parking, jury assembly park. A new building that would link and house a series of public spaces, but in a very long, low-slung way with an earth or sod roof, parking suppressed underneath it. A new medium-sized theater that would complement the auditorium, which seats 2,000. An auditorium entrance here. There would be a large flat floor space which serves a number of purposes. It can be for events. It really makes a more gracious entry. It also allows the Civic Center to get more permanent seating within the auditorium, because right now it's temporary collapsible seating so that during the fair a large flat floor area for the craft and exhibits can occur. That's compromised the acoustics for many years. The proposal for a restaurant and a grand walkway along the edge to skirt the water, to provide shelter from the views from the parking field, and to bring you into that great plaza. The buildings in their most diagrammatic form respect the auditorium that's here and propose just what I would call a frontispiece, a lobby of adequate size that brings the circulation in around each side to enter the auditorium. A connection that moves through, which would house potentially a new library, gallery, the new exhibit hall, so that could be removed, and a medium-sized theater where the public elements, the glassy lobbies, can look across the mall towards each other. So again, parking underneath a low-slung roof that could be an earth roof to give a quiet, long stretch that would combine these public spaces. The lobby, just in a diagrammatic function, replacing this collapsible seating function, moving out, sliding in so it doesn't touch, interfere, or change the roof line of the building. Some simple cardboard massing where you see the idea of the Hall of Justice coming across and the grand axis that connects to the existing auditorium, and that coming across to the theater, the long, low-slung building that does a lot of the public work, the great public mall, and again, the reflection back towards Mount Tam, the hill, and of course the spire. The plan, all told, as Manuel has gone through, and just to see how these elements come together, even circulations, lines of sight, all of that would be brought back to the spire, and this, of course, would be designed to service with the county fair. So for that vital week each summer, the whole open space would basically allow that to happen. And lastly, a few images drawn back: the water, the long, low-slung building, the new theater, and the expanded, modernized, and renovated auditorium. Moving in closer, sliding out under the roof, the whole rooftop being available for circulation and access, the public plaza, the covered walk, the view across the great lawn to the water, and just the low-slung sodden roof, so that from a distance, the connection between the great public building is quiet, and it's about the landscape. What you see are the ridges beyond. The open public space, the great flexible space, and the tree-lined lawn to the left, and then lastly, the idea of making a great outdoor room with a focus, a hard edge and a soft edge, a focus back towards Mount Tam, the Frank Loyd Wright building, the spire, and the lagoon. So these are all the aspects that we've been working on for a long time and would love to see in the future generation actually come to fruition, make more out of the Civic Center as a whole than it is today. And we believe it will be in the spirit of what Frank Loyd Wright actually envisioned 50 years ago, which is not just build on the whole site, but to draw it all together into one magnificent vision that he had for what the home for democracy in this county would look like, for justice, for government, for recreation, and for community. So with that said, I think it's time to turn on the lights and ask John to lead us through a conversation.
So I have plenty of questions, but it's 25 minutes to 8, so I'm actually going to go straight to letting people ask questions. If I'm guessing there'll be a lot of questions, but if it's a slow pace, I'll throw my own questions in, because I thought each of the presentations was terrific, each in a very different way, and a round of applause. And so what I want to do, basically you come up here and ask questions into the mic. And then if you have trouble moving or whatever, David, who is here somewhere, can provide you a microphone. But anyone who wants to start with a question is welcome to come up. Yes, we'll start with this woman here.
I think it's a very ambitious plan for the Marin Center. The Marin Municipal Water District has been trying to get us to conserve for years and not have lawns. So that's one aspect that I'm concerned about. I'm a volunteer usher at Marin Center, and there's hardly any money to repair the ripping carpets on those portable stairs. So I'm just wondering where the county thinks the money is going to come from to do
Well,
this.
I'll rephrase it slightly. I mean, I think a good question for the supervisor would be, here is a plan. How does the plan become more than something that an architecture writer like me looks at and thinks, boy, that's a nice looking plan? So, Supervisor Kinsey.
Sure, thank you. Excellent question and the exciting vision. Two things. I'll respond to the water question, the water conservation question first, which is that the entire campus is irrigated with recycled water, and that is a piece of MMWD's water supply that they really have not found a market for. So if there's ever a place in Marin that could have greener landscapes, it would be here using recycled water. In terms of the big vision that you saw in that master plan, I would say that the unique aspect of that we envision is, as we call it, the Renaissance Project, is that it would be a public and a private partnership. So this would not fall solely on the shoulders or even primarily on the shoulders of taxpayers. This would be a contribution from our county's general funds in association with funds that would be raised by others. And we're going to see a very exciting example of that next year when our public-private partnership that we began with the Ag Institute of Marin, or the farmers market as we call it, goes before voters to support a permanent farmers market on the Christmas tree lot, and they will be taking the primary responsibility for raising the funds. So moving right along to the other cultural facilities, I think the same spirit of partnership will work.
Terrific, thanks. Next question. Oh, if you can, again, anyone who has a question, if they can come up to the podium, so that we can get this recorded and filmed and all those exciting things.
So I noticed on the plans that there's the stuff that's on this side of Civic Center Drive, and it's my understanding that that's protected. And then there's the acreage that is planned for the Renaissance Center. But starting from the jury parking lot, like if you're in the jury parking lot and you're looking towards it, that's not part of the plan. There's nothing planned. It would just be left as it is. And that would also include like the area where there are the trees and then going back past the fire station. So that would, what is that area like?
Do you have to push? Do I push a button?
The plan
No, you're
for
ready
that?
to go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. As I said originally, we were hired to do a plan for the Marin Center, which was the area you're talking about, the jury parking lot, the park itself, the kind of area by the post office was not part of our scope of work. And so I don't believe it was even drawn on our plan, or if it was kind of ghosted out because we did not study that area.
So I guess I'm wondering, does the Board of Supervisors?
Sure, this sounds almost like a dog park preservation question. We currently have a dog park there. We have a very, very active dog using community who would preciously love to see it stay a dog park to eternity. We were on the verge of putting our public safety building there a couple years ago before the Ross Commons came along and made much more sense financially and even politically. But I think what we reserve is for future boards to make decisions about how best to use that area, whether it would continue in its semi-open space condition, whether I think that we're actually envisioning that the fire station will need to be replaced and probably improved, and we've had conversations with the city of San Rafael about a partnership with them. They currently lease the building. So there will be change in that area, but there's nothing in the foreseeable future.
And so if dogs can learn to drive, the problem's solved. It'll be a dog parking lot. I'm just being the witty outsider. Next question. And a cat owner. So the next question. It's a race.
I would like to welcome all of you to our house. My name is Felix Warburg. I was the member of the Planning Commission from 1960 to 1966 and was witness to a lot of what we've been talking about today, including the seating in the commission chambers, the Planning Commission chambers, which is backwards because of the curvature of the library building. I don't know if it's still that way or not, but it's the only time I know where the chair was in front of everybody else and you didn't really know whether they were asleep or listening or what. But there's one piece that I think you should all know about, and I'm going to ask for a raising of hands to commemorate this. How many of you knew that the city of this building, the Civic Center design, was stopped at one point by the Board of Supervisors? Yes. Well, I think this is something you should all know. The Marin Board of Supervisors, who sits in this chamber now, we were down the hill in the library building at the time, the Board of Supervisors voted, there were several, I won't mention any names because I might get sued because some of them are very controversial, voted to stop the Civic Center building while it was under construction to change it into a county hospital. And this was an absolutely incredible thing to have happen. And some of us, I was on the Planning Commission at the time, and I looked up the law very carefully because I knew I'd be challenged by at least 2, maybe 3 of the supervisors for actually appearing. Now, you should know that you're an elected official. You're a different category than an official as a planning commissioner who is appointed. Appointed people are citizens like everybody else. They challenged me and said, you cannot appear, Mr. Warburg. And I said, well, it takes a 4/5 vote to remove me as a citizen, and I don't think you got the votes there. And I said, you're going to be the laughing stock of the world if you stop this building and this whole project in order to put in a hospital. And luckily enough, we got it changed around, and here we are. And so I spent all the time, I was on the commission when the building opened. I was chair of the commission from 64 to 66. And I think this is a wonderful occasion and a wonderful way to remember Mr. Wright. And I'm glad to hear people calling him Mr. Wright because he insisted on that. And I also worked with Wesley Peters and Aaron Green on some of the follow-up pieces. And it's so nice to be back here again. I wish we can all keep this going another 50 years.
My question is sort of a detail, not as monumental or significant as that. I had a question about the plan. I'm glad to see that, for example, you identified and are seeking a solution to solve just being able to walk reasonably around the pond, especially with the stroller. And clearly in your design, you have decided that it seems to me a very significant element of that is this bridge that bisects the large lagoon. And it bisects it, I assume, so that you can move people from over here to over there in a direct fashion. What I didn't see in the drawing was when I get to the north side of the pond, and I get off of what will probably be a very controversial and expensive bridge, a walkway. Where am I again? It looks like to me I just arrived at a dead end, and that I now get to walk across this new lovely lawn, which should be much more wonderful than the asphalt and gravel that's there now. But if I was going to the entrance to the theater or going over this way, I need to put on my galoshes, it looks like.
No, actually, it's a great question, but you'd be coming across the bridge on axis with the new lobby that projects out to the east.
I saw it was on axis. I just saw green between the end of
There's
the
a
wall.
path system.
Oh, it
Yeah.
just wasn't on the
So
drawing.
it would be
Okay.
lit in the evening, and it would really make, the idea is to make that rather long walk from the jury assembly parking lot to the lobby seem fun, and people want to do it. The alternative to provide sufficient parking might have been to expand or have more parking in other places, and we really see the site as being too valuable
I just
for other
didn't- I didn't
uses,
see
so
in
we
the
want to get
drawing.
more use out of the parking that's there.
Hello, I can well appreciate the daunting task of adding on to a complex like this. Controversy is stalking you at every moment. Every line you draw is a moment, no doubt, for deep interior reflections as a designer. And yet, when I look at your plan, I wonder, where's Frank Loyd Wright? Where's the original idea? It seems to me as if there has been a timid attempt not to offend, but no real attempt to connect. I mean, sight lines and axes are beautiful, especially in Roman villas and Palladian campuses, but that's not what organic architecture is about. I think it's fair to make a different building and to evolve and call it a contemporary architecture, but to blend with a hill in the distance seems to me to be a rather short-sighted organic notion. It seems to me that Wright was very bold, he was audacious, and it is hard to be audacious today, but I think that at the very least, regardless of style, an audaciousness is required to fit the context of this campus, and I encourage controversy to be attacked and to be engaged, and maybe a few more circles than just the bridge would be okay.
Okay. Thank you. I do think there'll be plenty of controversy regardless. I think controversy we will have no shortage of. And but to be honest, we approach these projects in a sometimes very specific way. But there's such a magnificent historic site, a landmark, and very important not just for the county, but as Professor Turner had talked about, in the legacy of Wright's entire body of work, that we want to really do things that are both consistent with his work and not detract from it. So we see the responsibility of our new buildings to be interesting, elegant, but to not in any way sort of beat our chest and say, well, we're just as powerful as Mr. Wright's creation. And so that's a fine line. As the design evolves, we will find ways where the building has a strong character of its own. But at the same time, I think it's important that the building always reflect and defer to the 50-year-old landmark that we already have, and to try not to upstage or compete with it. So it's a fine line. It'll take a long time to find that balance, and when we go forward, we will.
I actually want to intervene with a question for Professor Turner, since this is kind of backdrop. This is an impressionistic question, not an exact scholarly question. But to what extent is this a Frank Loyd Wright building, and to what extent is it a dramatic Frank Loyd Wright concept actually finished up by Taliesin? You know, in other words, Wright was at a point in his career where he would come to a site once, he would kind of have that inspiration, and then he would move on. I doubt very much Frank Loyd Wright designed the little thing that comes out here that I keep almost tripping on when I step back. So just in a real general sense, what's your sense of to what extent this is Wright, and to what extent is it Wesley Peters and Taliesin, you know, is like saying, well, let's do swirls and bubbles in the supervisor's room?
Yeah. Well, that's really an excellent question. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Good. And it's one that I've thought about a good deal myself, but I'm not the best person to answer that. And there are people right here, I'm sure, who can answer the question better. People who worked with Aaron Green and know the project and the history of it better. But I think you're absolutely right, John, that Wright, especially at this time, right at the end of his career, was not working out all of the details of his designs, even when he was still alive. His associates and the Taliesin fellows were clearly working with him. What's clear, I think, is that the concept is his. That all the evidence suggests that, but that the details and including much of the interior details were worked out after his death by Aaron Green and Wesley Peters and others, and then of course that they supervised the execution with all of the changes and details and things that go on when you start executing a building. So it is in that sense, was a collaborative project, but in some ways, probably the overall concept of the bridges, bridging the hills, and the way they're organized in a general kind of way, probably is the greatest part of the design, in my opinion, and so I think it can be considered a Frank Loyd Wright design, but like many of his designs, even earlier in his career, they were designs that were worked out in collaboration with his staff.
John, I'd like to just augment that a bit too and say that I think within any office that's successful and that has grown and has a number of people and a number of projects, this issue, I think, is in play. If you were to study the work of Corbusier, he would typically paint all morning, eat a long lunch, show up at his office at about 2 o'clock, leave at about 6:30 for cocktails and socialize and try to generate the next project. And while he generated the concept, certainly the dutiful execution was all within a larger gestalt, a larger body of thought that each architect had evolved over a period of time, project by project. It was somewhat iterative, but it was somewhat clear as a kind of conceptual framework around which details happened. And so I would venture to say, while I was obviously not involved, that this building is probably as intimately designed by Wright, so to speak, working with a body of other architects within his office, as many projects authored by many other notable architects would have been then and would be today. And that's really the way all buildings get built. And then you add to that layers of structural, mechanical, electrical engineers, landscape architects, and others, and they always end up being anywhere from 30 to 100 people are touching the building. The question is, what's the overall gestalt to which those ideas and details are falling under?
Yeah. I might just point out, though, that I think I agree with you completely about that. The difference in this case, however, is the fact that Wright died before ground was even broken or before the project began, and so he was not around to supervise in an overall kind of way and to say, no, you can't do that. It has to be this way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The one thing I can say as a fairly tall person and knowing that Frank Loyd Wright was a fairly tall person is I don't think he designed the folding chairs. That's my contribution to the discussion. Are there other questions from anyone?
You might also point out that the only office Frank Loyd Wright had, other than the retaliations, was 619 Grand Street in San Francisco.
I didn't know that. 619 Grand Street in San Francisco. That's interesting. Yes. 390.
Yeah, that was where Aaron Green's office was. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. I first came to this building as a small child when it first opened, and never dreaming that I would spend 25 years of my life working in the building. But I have, and I see a lot of people around here that have spent their careers here and that have come to know this building intimately as I have. I think a lot of us wonder who was responsible for all the roof leaks.
Now,
Is that an inherent design flaw?
Fixed.
No, it's really one of the things that those of us that work in the building have come to love and respect about it. It's not perfect.
Okay, we have a question in the back.
Yes, I had two questions. One, I understand that Aaron Green was responsible for the scallops on the roof. Is that true? The roof design, the scallop, Aaron Green. And the second question is, I understand that the public housing, the Golden Gate Village, was designed and worked on previous to Frank Loyd Wright gaining the this job, this commission for the Civic Center. Is that true? And do you know the concept of false borders in terms of historic preservation for Golden Gate Village as well as the Civic Center?
Okay, I don't know either. I would doubt the scallop part because that's so integral to the concept. But
I don't know the answer to that either. But I'm wondering if there's maybe someone here in the audience. Is Bill Schwartz here?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know exactly? Do you know about what parts were created by Aaron Green? And
I do, but to some extent I do, but I don't know all of it, and some of it preceded me. I have my colleague Richard next to me might know the answer to this question. Is a question about the roof ornament?
Yeah.
The roof ornament was Frank Loyd Wright's concept because he was concerned that the long expanse of poured concrete would waver and deflect over time, and the roof ornament would break up that even line so that it would be less disturbing. Now, I don't think Frank Loyd Wright personally worked out the detail of every one of those ornaments. That probably did not happen that way, but he indicated it should be that way. Yeah. Richard might have something to add to this.
Yeah, the roof ornament was worked out by Wesley Peters, and this was done after Mr. Wright died. And that's how it happened. The other thing that I think is maybe worth addressing is that Mr. Wright was really involved in the design of this building, in not just the design, but in the production of the what we now call design development. And I can remember an afternoon in the studio Taliesin West where Mr. Wright and Wesley Peters had a great argument about how I call them spandrels, the suspended arches, how that was to be constructed. Mr. Wright wanted to do it in gunite, gun concrete, and Wes was absolutely opposed to it. I don't know if they ever settled the argument, but it was, after Mr. Wright died, it was obviously done with light gauge metal and so forth. But, as an indication of how things were managed at the time, I thought that might be useful to know.
Yeah, I'm Chan Novi, president of Aaron Green Associates. I worked for Aaron for almost 50 years. To answer most questions about this building, Aaron wrote a book
It's called An Architecture for Democracy. And in that book, you'll get to read in detail the architect's tale of how this building came about. It will answer just about any of your questions. It'll give you a picture of who the players were and what they did. And I think that's the best place to go. We could talk for hours and hours and hours about the building, but in Aaron's own words, from the horse's mouth, from the person that Frank Loyd Wright told the Board of Supervisors, they asked him, who is Aaron Green, at a meeting? And he turned to Aaron and he turned to them and he said, Aaron Green is my son. He felt strongly about it. The thing about the relationship was Mr. Wright knew if anything happened to him, the building would be in competent hands. Mr. Wright designed this building. No one else designed this building. The interior, that's a different matter. Mr. Wright wasn't around, and as everybody said, someone's got to do it, and he had good people there working for him that day.
Okay, and I think we're going to need to be wrapping up for time. Thank you all for coming and staying so long, especially those of you who also went on the tour. And I want to thank the panelists. I learned a lot. I'm sure, except for maybe these three guys at the back and Felix, I'm sure everybody learned a lot. It was a terrific panel, and thank you so much for letting me sit in.
Great. Thank you, John.
Yes. And I just wanted to say thank you to John for moderating this and for all of our panelists for participating and for your attendance. And make one brief announcement that on October 30th in this room at 5 o'clock, we'll be presenting a play about the Marin Civic Center and its building and some of these work stoppages and all the characters who played a role in bringing this building about and or potentially stalling it from happening. So I invite you to join us for that. And again, thank you all for coming.